This talk to the Georgetown University College Republicans is an hour 10 minutes.
Welcome. My name is Happy Johnson. I am the Vice Chair of the Georgetown University College Republicans and a member of the Lecture Fund. Both these groups are very honored to have our special guest this evening. He is a nationally known author and lifelong civil rights leader and is the author of a new book called Unholy Alliances. Georgetown, please welcome David Horowitz.
Thank you. I'm going to talk tonight on a subject that nobody really wants to talk about because nobody wants to confront. It is what I call the unholy alliance between radical Islam and the American left. On February 14th, 2003, which was about 6 weeks before United States and British troops entered Iraq, Osama bin Laden issued one of his fatwas on Al Jazeera TV. And in it he said, the interests of Muslims and the interests of the socialists coincide in the war against the Crusaders. And what he was referring to was the fact that 4 weeks earlier, millions of leftists in the capitals of Europe and actually in some capitals of Asia and in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco and New York and many other American cities went out into the streets to try to prevent the United States and Great Britain from toppling Saddam Hussein, one of the worst monsters of the 20th century, which is full of monsters, or was full of monsters. They chanted no blood for oil. They called the United States the world's greatest terrorist state. And they called Washington the axis of evil and compared George Bush to Adolf Hitler. When they failed to save Saddam Hussein, the leaders of the American organizations marched their troops into the Democratic primary campaigns behind the candidacies of Dennis Kucinich, but much more importantly, Howard Dean. The leaders of one of the two groups that organized the peace protests was International Answer, a front group for the Workers' World Party, which is a Marxist-Leninist party aligned with communist North Korea. The moderate group of peace organizing these demonstrations to prevent the United States and Britain from toppling Saddam Hussein was a group called United for Peace and Justice, led by Leslie Kagan, a veteran 60s leftist, a member of the Communist Party until after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a pro-Castro spokesman. Other organizers had similar backgrounds. I need to begin tonight by touching on two key words, or two key issues that even looking at this issue will undoubtedly raise, because what I'm going to suggest, well, what happened was, of course, the political left entered the Howard Dean campaign, and Howard Dean soon became the leading candidate for the nomination. In fact, he was being anointed by Jimmy Carter and Al Gore when Democrats or the media or whoever decided he was unelectable and turned to John Kerry. And one of the many troubling aspects of the candidacy of John Kerry is that this is a man who supported and spoke on the Senate floor in support of toppling Saddam Hussein and declaring that he was a menace to mankind, and endorsed the war after the fact and was a pro-war spokesman until he saw himself losing the Democratic Party nomination. Whereupon, on this matter of war and peace, a matter affecting the security of 300 million Americans and people around the world, he reversed himself 180 degrees for his own presidential ambitions. And since I will probably make many partisan remarks tonight, let me take a moment to honor a Democrat who didn't do that, which is Joe Lieberman. Joe Lieberman is a statesman in the Democratic Party. He was the vice presidential nominee last time. He should have been the presidential nominee this time. But he is a man of principle and understood how vital it was for the United States and Britain to take down Saddam Hussein, and gave up his basically sacrificed his presidential ambition for the principle. Would that he were the Democratic Party candidate. The two issues I need to discuss are, of course, the issue of treason, patriotism, which comes up, and the question of legitimate criticism of foreign policy. To listen to the left, you would think that any criticism of American policy is equated by mean-spirited Republicans and conservatives with treason, and that they are waiting. The lampposts already have been strung with rope for leftists to step out of line. Let us get real. Al Gore has already called the President of the United States a traitor. He betrayed America, and on TV, and in everybody's living room. The Democratic attacks on the President, that he lied to the American people, misled them into a war, killed their children to line the pockets of his cronies at Halliburton, is an accusation of treason. If that isn't treason, I don't know what is. But the fact is that nobody in America takes treason very seriously, and hasn't for a long time. There has not been an individual in the United States charged with treason in 50 years, not since the Second World War. Not the Rosenbergs, who stole atomic secrets for the Soviet Union. Not Jane Fonda, who, like Tokyo Rose and Axis Sally, went on enemy radio in the midst of a war and called on our soldiers to defect and denounced them as war criminals and collaborated with the torturers of American POWs. Not Aldrich Ames, the spy. Not John Walker Lind, who fought with the Taliban against his own country. None of these people were charged with treason. The fear of mentioning the word treason or patriotism is a red herring designed to stop people from thinking about an issue which affects our national security, which means the lives of everyone in this room and everyone in the television audience. Don't even think about it, is the agenda of people who raise this. What is treason? Well, it's really quite simple, isn't it? Treason is when your country is at war and you want the other side to win. Are there such people in America? Well, let's take a very famous one, Michael Moore. Michael Moore is on the record saying that the terrorists in Iraq who are beheading our citizens and the citizens of other countries and are killing our soldiers and many Iraqis are not terrorists. According to Michael Moore, they are patriots, and in his words, they will win. Michael Moore is rooting for the enemy. That's just a fact. And Michael Moore has rooted for the enemy, as have the leaders of the so-called peace demonstrations against, to save Saddam Hussein from America and Britain, rooted for the communists in the Cold War, worked to help them. Michael Moore was, in fact, one of the reasons he was fired from Mother Jones magazine, a left-wing magazine, is because he censored an article by Paul Berman that was very mildly critical of the communist dictatorship there. Michael Moore is an old-time Leninist, an enemy of America, self-conceived. Of course he says there's no war on terror, because he sees us, as do so many people on the left, as an imperialist power who is responsible for the attacks upon itself. And when you consider that Michael Moore is the darling of one of the principal funding bases of the Democratic Party, the Hollywood left, and when you consider that his opening was attended and hailed by the leader of the Democratic Party, Terry McAuliffe, by Senator Clinton, by Senator Daschle, by Senator Harkin, and many other Democrats, you can see how morally we have slipped in this country. When we don't take our enemies seriously, in an era when one crop duster with an anthrax canister can kill 100,000 Americans, then we are in trouble. Now, if you think about it, there's good treason and bad treason. Treason doesn't end the issue. Our founders, after all, were traitors, weren't they? One of them, I'm getting so old, I think it was Benjamin Franklin, said, if this be treason, let's make the most of it. What decides the issue is, of course, the principle. If America is the greatest terrorist state, if America is an imperialist monster, then loyalty to humanity would make you treasonous to America, wouldn't it? And that is what actually the code that most people on the radical left live by. So you have to decide in your own minds whether a nation, which when the World Trade Center was attacked, there were people from 80 different countries in that building, whether a nation as tolerant, as open as America is worthy of destruction. If you think it is, then you can embrace Michael Moore and be comfortable about it. If it isn't, you better think twice. There is criticism of every policy that is legitimate. There is no policy that is beyond criticism, not even war policy. But there is criticism and there is criticism. It is one thing to worry before the fact whether the war in Iraq would cause the Arab street to erupt and whether it would inflame the Muslim world. It is quite another thing when the war has been won in 6 weeks, in the swiftest victory and historical record and the most costless, to then attack the commander-in-chief as a liar and a fraud, as leaders of the Democratic Party did, most shamefully Ted Kennedy and Al Gore. That is quite another thing when you are inciting Americans to hate their own commander-in-chief in the middle of the war. It is quite another thing to do, as Michael Moore did in his film Fahrenheit 9/11, portray Iraq, a country in which 1 million people had been murdered, in which there were plastic shredders for human beings, in which there was a prison that we closed down for 4 to 12-year-olds, and to portray it as an idyllic place into which the American marauders interpose themselves with their advanced technologies to blow innocent people to bits. That is no longer criticism. That is undermining, sabotaging the war on terror and softening us up for the kill. There is criticism that is criticism to help us defend ourselves, and there is criticism that is criticism to destroy us. And then there is a gray area. You can ask yourself, when there is a minor incident in a prison, regrettable, unfortunate, common to all wars. All wars have their atrocities. As atrocities go, Abu Ghraib was pretty minor. When that appears 50 days on the front page of the New York Times, and there is this dramatic hand-wringing over it, then you have to wonder what's going on here. Some people will do this because out of complacency. They still think America is invulnerable. They haven't absorbed what 9/11 means. And they think, this is a free country, you can say anything you want. And you can, but it has consequences. And I'm here tonight to try to remind you of the consequences. Let's look at the nature of this war. In the first place, it is a war that it is very hard to understand how anybody who is decent, who believes in human rights, who believes in women's rights, who believes in equality and freedom could not support. George Bush, in 4 years, has liberated nearly 50 million people in 2 Islamic countries, Afghanistan and Iraq. He has stopped the filling of mass graves. He has stopped the torture chambers. He has allowed Iraqis and the people of Afghanistan to adopt or begin a political process which will give them rights, and particularly women rights, for the first time in 5,000 years, or since the Garden of Eden, since we're talking about Iraq. How can you not support this war? The second thing to understand about the war, or to think about the war, is that it never was about WMDs, not about weapons of mass destruction. In their frenzy to destroy the credibility of the President of the United States and the Commander-in-Chief of our armed forces and the head of security for the entire world, since there's no other country willing to do this except for Great Britain and our allies like Poland, who don't have really the means to do it. I lost my thought there for a second. The Democrats' attacks have undermined George Bush's credibility. But the Democrats supported this war. This is very important to remember. There was an authorization resolution in the House and in the Senate. The authorization to go to war by both houses of Congress, something that Bill Clinton never sought when he went to war in Kosovo, has 23 clauses. I invite you to go up on the web and read the 23 clauses. Out of 23 clauses, I found one that even mentions stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. One. 12 of them refer to UN resolutions. And they refer to UN resolutions because, as you remember, Saddam Hussein invaded 2 countries, Iran and then Kuwait. And we went to war with him over Kuwait. The Iran-Iraq war, I mean, every time you think of something, has also been tremendously distorted. Yes, we provided weapons to Iraq, but that was to prevent Iran from winning, which we did. Iran was a radical Islamic, it was the first radical Islamic government. It has 3 times the population of Iraq, and it had crowds of 1 million in Tehran chanting death to America. So it was a good thing for us to tilt to Saddam and neutralize Iran. That's all that's about. It's not about supporting Saddam Hussein. The UN resolutions, we went to war to pull him out of Kuwait, and there was a truce at the end of the war. And that truce was sealed by UN resolutions, resolutions 687 and 689. And the resolution said Saddam Hussein will disarm, he will stop developing weapons of mass destruction. How do we know he was developing weapons of mass destruction? Because he gassed the Kurds. He will stop those programs, and he will stop repressing the ethnic and religious minorities in Iraq. Actually, it's a majority. The Shiites is what he was repressing, and the Kurds. That's the UN resolutions. And he disobeyed them, and disobeyed them. And finally, he threw the UN inspectors out, and which is an act of war, because it was a truce, and he broke the truce. That was in 1998. And Bill Clinton fired 450 missiles into Iraq and got an Iraqi Liberation Act that John Kerry and the Democrats signed. But Bill Clinton was a little busy in 1998 with an intern. So probably one of the, well, certainly the most irresponsible presidency from the point of view of foreign policy in the history of mankind. But that was the reality. But Bill Clinton at least understood, as John Kerry and Tom Daschle and Al Gore did in 1998, that Saddam Hussein had violated a truce. He was an aggressor. He had massive weapons programs that he hadn't stopped, and he was throwing the UN inspectors out. Why would you throw the UN inspectors out if it wasn't your intention to go on the first chance you got and build weapons of mass destruction and use them? This is a man who tried to assassinate the President of the United States. He hated us. Yes, there were huge terrorist links. You can read Stephen Hayes' book, The Connection, between Saddam Hussein, the government of Iraq, and al-Qaeda and all the terrorist organizations. They held conferences in Iraq. But the fact was, the United States was standing there, and he was afraid of the United States. He threw the weapons inspectors out. Bill Clinton fired more cruise missiles into Iraq than he had been fired in the whole Gulf War, but you can't do things just by firing missiles. We were a paper tiger. That's basically what we were. Until 9/11. On 9/11, the world changed. The world we live in is a world in which terrorists, individuals, can get access to chemical, biological, and soon, if not now, if not tomorrow, nuclear weapons, and get them into the United States. This is no longer state to state. This is us against the terrorists. If you ask yourself whether you're safer because of George Bush, think of this. On 9/12/2001, nobody in this room or in the television audience would have bet that we would not be attacked for 3 more years. Nobody would have bet that we would be safe in this country for the next 3 years. Why? Because we know we have no borders. We have 11 million illegal people here who don't know who they are or where they are. And 100,000 of them are estimated to be from the Middle East. The only reason we haven't been attacked is because George Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld have taken the war to the enemy camp. The only defense in a war like this that will work is an offense. They have taken out 3/4 of al-Qaeda, and they have kept the al-Qaeda, and it's not just al-Qaeda that we're fighting. They have kept the Zarqawis, the Zawahiris, Hamas, Hezbollah, all of them off balance because we are on the offensive. Something that we need to maintain, and that I do not know what John Kerry's intentions here. When he says he wants to criminalize the war again and not make it a war, it makes me very nervous. The UN, after 9/11, George Bush looked at Iraq and said, countries, he looked at first of all, at Afghanistan. This is a poor country. People who say Iraq was no threat, well, why was Afghanistan a threat? It's a much poorer country than Iraq. It doesn't have the oil wealth. It wasn't about to make a deal with North Korea to buy their nuclear weapons. It probably didn't have the money. So why was Afghanistan a threat? Because it gave the terrorists a base. Because you can hide things in diplomatic pouches. Because governments have privileges that individuals don't. passports, all kinds of things, intelligence services. So if Afghanistan was a threat, you know that Iran and Iraq were bigger threats. And the difference between Iran and Iraq is that we were at war with Iraq. Or didn't you notice that we were flying over the no-fly zones, were zones where we flew, to prevent Saddam Hussein from flying there with poison gas to gas the Kurds. The attacks on this war are wretched. Never in American history has half the country been taken out of a war by a political leadership in the midst of the war, and a war that we were winning and that we need to win. What is the alternative to taking, if you read the Dulfer report, where CIA's just issued a report, the media, which has now been sucked into the Jimmy Carter, Al Gore, sabotage the war on terror, do anything to get a Republican out of the White House, even if it costs 100,000 American lives, school of thought. Has portrayed the Dulfer report as saying there were no WMDs. What the Dulfer report says is that Saddam Hussein had one overriding agenda, which was to remove the sanctions, remove the inspectors, and build weapons of mass destruction. Bill Clinton, because he wasn't paying attention or paying attention to the wrong things, allowed Saddam Hussein to throw out the UN inspectors without invading him. After 9/11, George Bush focused on Iraq and said, we are going to force you to comply with the truce, with the UN resolutions, now 16 of them, that you have disobeyed, or else. When George Bush, and when Kerry says rush to war, what is he talking about? The Axis of Evil speech was in January, a year before, more than a year before we entered Iraq. Al Gore gave a speech, his first foreign policy speech since 2000, praising Bush for calling Iraq part of the Axis of Evil, and saying in the speech, we have to do whatever is necessary to deal with this threat. Shame on Al Gore for betraying his own vision over Iraq and risking American lives to do so. Shame on the whole Democratic Party for betraying a war it had signed on to just to get a political gain. The Democratic Party in this election, whatever the outcome, has sacrificed the safety of 300 million Americans for political gain. Nothing higher. There was no rush to war. Bush announced gave a speech at West Point in June. The war occurred the following March, warning Saddam and saying we mean business. You will disarm or we will disarm you. That is no rush to war. Then he went to the UN in September. Then he got the authorization, 77 to 23 in the Senate from the Democratic Party. Joint Senate House resolutions authorizing him to use force to enforce the UN's resolutions. Then he got the Security Council, 15 votes, 15-0, behind Resolution 1441, which said, you will disarm and show that you have disarmed in a report, or else. I have read Hans Blick's book. I don't know how many people have, because Hans Blick said this was a war ultimatum. Although Hans Blick himself was, in principle, being a leftist, against war under any of these circumstances. A deadline was given. The resolution was passed on November 8th. It was a 30-day deadline. On December 7th, the deadline passed, and Saddam Hussein, if you'll remember, delivered a 12,000 smoke and mirrors report. And if you read Hans Blick's book, he says this report was disingenuous. It was not a report. How many times could you say to Saddam Hussein, do it or else? Why were the UN inspectors there in the first place? Because George Bush put 200,000 troops on the Iraqi border. How long do you think the United States can focus its entire attention on Iraq and have 200,000 troops at whatever it costs, $1 billion a week, sitting in the desert, right? This was before summer, through summer, waiting for Saddam Hussein to stop playing games. It can't be done. John Kerry did not have another plan. There is no other plan. You either take the dictator down or you appease him. The Democratic Party is a party of appeasement. That's what this whole episode is about. It wants to continue the delusion, denial, probably the most important human psychological reflex, to deny that there's a hard choice ahead, that we are either going to have to fight the dictator now or we will have to fight him later when it's much worse. The war was not about an imminent threat. George Bush, in so many words, in his State of the Union right before the war, said, we are not going to wait until Saddam Hussein is an imminent threat. An imminent threat is what? When he already has the weapons in place and the plan is afoot, or when he strikes. We cannot afford to let these countries, Muslim dictatorships is what they are, running on the 7th century law, or in Iraq, a fascist regime that had joined the Muslim Jihad. We can't wait around to see what's going to happen. How did the Democratic Party get to this place? Well, it does have very much to do with the Howard Dean campaign, but before that, it has to do with the McGovern campaign 30 years ago. The left has never learned the lessons of Vietnam. I, as you probably know, began my life in the left. My parents were card-carrying communists. My first march was against a war. I was 9 years old. And we were marching down 7th Avenue in New York and chanting 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want another war. The war was Harry Truman's war against Stalin. What the peace movement wanted then was that Stalin could liberate Eastern Europe, which he had enslaved. Not that much has really changed in 50 years. I was one of the organizers of the first demonstration against the Vietnam War at Berkeley. I will tell you, everybody who organized that demonstration was a Marxist, a leftist who thought that the communists were liberating Vietnam. Just the way Michael Moore thinks Zarqawi is liberating Iraq. Exactly the same way. By that time, I was a new leftist, so I knew that the North Vietnamese communists were not such good people, something that John Kerry did not seem to understand at the time. I would never have been part of the Winter Soldier investigation and John Kerry and Jane Fonda's antics, because I knew that Jane Fonda was an idiot who had embraced the communists and committed treason. Apparently, John Kerry didn't grasp that, and he got himself in bed with people who had hatred for the United States, just like the hatred for Bush. This hatred is psychotic. Democrats have just flipped their lids in this election. This is a decent man. This is a man you can disagree with, but you can't hate George Bush. If you hate George Bush, there's something wrong with you. It may be only momentary, but it's wrong. That hatred for country is what drives the left. It's a hate America left. And John Kerry got sucked into it. I don't believe that John Kerry is a hate America leftist today, but he did get sucked into it in the early 70s. What did John Kerry and Teddy Kennedy and Howard Dean do? The United States, Nixon signed a truce in Vietnam and withdrew our soldiers in 1973. John Kerry and Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden conducted a campaign to persuade the Democrats in Congress to cut all aid to South Vietnam and Cambodia. All aid. When Nixon went down in Watergate, the Democrats' majority in the House and in the Senate cut the aid. It was their first act, January 1975. In April, the Cambodian and South Vietnamese regime fell. This is very important because this is exactly what Terry McAuliffe is proposing for Iraq now. They cut the aid to the two regimes that we were defending against the communists. And the communists won, and within 3 years they had slaughtered 2.5 million people. The blood of those people is on the heads of John Kerry and Ted Kennedy and Howard Dean and myself. The difference between the four of us is that I understand that now, which is why I'm not going to vote for John Kerry in this election. If we cut and run in Iraq, if we are defeated, we are in a war. This is a test of wills. We either win or we lose. There's no middle ground in a war. You don't get to sort of step aside. If we lose, there will be a bloodbath in Iraq and in other countries in Asia. They will slaughter, they will behead our friends, our allies, all the Iraqis who are struggling for freedom. They will have been betrayed a second and third time. But this bloodbath will flow into the streets of Washington and New York and Los Angeles and potentially every major American city. These enemies have sworn to kill us all. And they have expressly said they want to kill 2 million American children. They are targeting our schools. People who think America is so invulnerable do not understand the modern world. The 9/11 attack took $600 billion out of the American economy. Suppose the terrorists had attacked again after 9/11. It practically it bankrupted the airlines industry, had to have a $15 billion bailout. The hotel industry had barely recovered. If during that Christmas there had been terrorist attacks in the major shopping malls in America, as was threatened, it could have taken down the whole American economy and then the world economy. And then you would have had governments toppling, and perhaps the government of Pakistan would be one of them, a nuclear power with a huge radical Islamic presence. What is the Democratic Party thinking to be jeopardizing all of our security over this political food fight? The really terrible decision was made by Jimmy Carter and Al Gore to make war a partisan issue. For 50 years in this country, we have had a bipartisan foreign policy. This was broken by Gore and by Carter to their everlasting disgrace. And we are now reaping the beginning, but just the beginning of the whirlwind, with the bitterness in our national politics, with the way we are presenting to the terrorists the image of a divided country, exactly the only America that can lose a war is a divided America. And this war, which is conducted by the left in our country, who have entered an unholy alliance with radical Islam, is a war also against our homeland security defenses. It may surprise you to know that there are 355 American cities who, under the agitation of the political left, the National Lawyers Guild, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the ACLU, 355 cities have signed pledges to refuse to cooperate with Homeland Security, particularly in the protection of our borders. Georgetown is a player in this treacherous fifth column left. Your law professor here, David Cole, is an intellectual leader of the movement against our borders, the movement against the Patriot Act, and he's a lawyer for terrorists, is what he is. Samuel Arian was actually the originator of the civil liberties against the Patriot Act movement. He founded an organization called the National Coalition for Political Freedom, Professor Samuel Arian of South Florida University, to attack Bill Clinton's, the first anti-terror act, passed by Bill Clinton in 1996. And the reason he was against the act, which allowed the use of secret evidence in terrorist cases, was because his brother-in-law was arrested under the act, because Sami al-Arian was the head of Palestine Islamic Jihad in North America and spent his time when he wasn't being a professor recruiting suicide bombers for the Middle East. And Sami al-Arian is a colleague of David Cole and the ACLU and the National Lawyers Guild, who still defend him, by the way, even though he's now in jail. Protected at the University of South Florida, by the way, against the FBI and courageous journalists like Steve Emerson, who had exposed al-Arian, by Barbara Coster, the president of the University of South Florida, who today is the Democratic Party's candidate for the U.S. Senate in Florida. And I'm not suggesting that Barbara Coster, I have no idea why Barbara Coster did this. I'm not suggesting that she is a leftist with radical agendas in the way I am suggesting that David Cole is. Maybe people get sucked into these things. I have written Unholy Alliance, this book, so that people can be informed about who this left is, because it's not a new left, it's a left that's been around for 70 years. And its patterns are very clear, as I show in the book. And Sami al-Arian isn't the only one. Lynn Stewart, who is a National Lawyers Guild lawyer, and has been indicted by Ashcroft and is defended by the ACLU, and they're both defended by the American Association of University Professors, of course, because a huge base of the anti-American left, which is in alliance with radical Islam, is right here in the universities. Your Middle Eastern Studies department has spent years throwing a smokescreen over terrorist groups. The head of it is John Esposito. Years throwing a smokescreen over terrorist groups, pretending that they're no threat to the United States, and claiming, along with Salon.com and The Nation magazine, that Sami al-Arian, the head of Palestine Islamic Jihad, a terrorist, is being persecuted by Ashcroft because he's a Muslim and a Palestinian. Lynn Stewart collaborated with her client was the blind sheik who masterminded the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. Lynn Stewart is on record saying she believes the terrorists are liberationists, freedom fighters. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. For Lynn Stewart, Zarqawi, blind sheik Abdul Rahman, those are freedom fighters. And she collaborated with him in conducting his terror. And she is defended. And she's probably defended by the Bar Association, for all I know. I think she is. And she tours campuses like Georgetown as the guest of the law schools. It will be a cold day in hell before I am invited by the law school at Georgetown University or Seattle University to give this lecture. How is it possible that people who think of themselves as being for social justice can lend aid and comfort to Islamic radicals who behead people, who blow women's heads off with AK-47s when they're suspected of having sexual relations outside marriage? Fornication, I think, is the English word for it. How can they embrace these people? They embrace them because well, first of all, under the rubric of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and their enemy is the United States. But they also do it under the delusion that is common to all radicals. It's the analog to the 72 virgins in heaven. Think of how sick our enemy is. They kill their own children. They strap bombs to little children, 14-year-olds. And they tell them, go over, find another 14-year-old and blow yourself and the Jew up, and you are going to go, if you're male, lucky enough to be male, you'll go to heaven and get 72 virgins. They're all doing it to get into paradise. It's exactly what the left is doing. Why does the left want to destroy America? To get into paradise. Call it socialism, call it communism, call it what you will. Social justice, that's the code now. Call it social justice. The radical does not understand that the root cause of social problems is us. There will never be a world with social justice because it's always going to be run by people. And we are flawed. And if you don't understand that, you're truly delusional. So the radical has the same goal. It's not the 72 virgins, it's the socialism. And the same enemy, the great Satan. You cannot read a page of Noam Chomsky or Howard Zinn or Michael Moore or Barbara Kingsolver or we could go down, or Molly Ivins, and not understand that America is the great Satan, the root of evil in the world, worthy of destruction. That's what forges this alliance. What forges it is the opposite of the idea of the enemy, and what is it? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The mantra of the left is, well, that is the mantra of the left. Our mantra, let me do that again. The left's mantra is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Out of sheer self-defense, America must take the view that the friend of my enemy is my enemy. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions. I can do my own emceeing unless the questions get to be rants, and then I will turn it over to somebody else.
Yes, Mr. Horowitz. Did I read correctly on your website that Halliburton's revenues doubled within a 2-year period, but that actually happened under the Clinton administration, that it was their contract that they have now is merely an extension of what they got under the Clinton administration beginning in 1998?
Possibly. I don't get to read everything that's on my website. My view of Halliburton and the constant invocation of Halliburton by the left and by the Democrats, I share this with Christopher Hitchens. I mean, let's see, who do they want to build the infrastructure of Iraq? Ben and Jerry's? There are only a couple of countries in the whole world that can do the job, and Halliburton happens to be one of them. This is the kind of the vulgar Marxism that has now pervades the Democratic Party. It's always, look for the money. Forgetting, of course, that they are on the take. All politicians take money. You can't, I mean, what is this campaign costing? $1 billion? Where do you think you're going to get the money from? You get it from people who are interested in government, which is big companies, big unions, and so forth. That's just the reality. Yes, sir.
You stated earlier in your lecture that you believe that the war on terror is a win or lose proposition, that it is one way or the other. I was curious, on the win side of things, what conditions do you envision that would constitute a win in the war on terror and thus an end to the war on terror?
This is a good question, except I was more specific. We are in a war in Iraq. It is a war that the Democratic Party signed on to. This is not, I would understand the anger against George Bush and the Republicans. If they had snuck in this war, say the way Clinton did in the war in Kosovo, just ordered a war. Didn't go to the UN, didn't go to the Congress, just have a war. Or when he fired missiles into the Sudan, 13 missiles. Just had the idea to do it today. Of course, I mean, our embassies were attacked, and I'm not actually faulting him for that, but that's the way it was done. 450 missiles into Iraq. That's the way it was done. The president said do it. George Bush didn't do that. He went to the Democrats. He got their support. He went to the UN. He got a unanimous Security Council resolution. The problem is the left is very clever, and they put 750,000 people in the streets of London, which would be the equivalent of 4 million people in the streets of Washington. And Tony Blair, because after all, Tony Blair, who is a heroic leader, is a socialist and a liberal. And that was his party in the streets. So Tony Blair begged Bush to go back to the UN. And the French and the Russians, who have spent the whole decade taking money from the corrupt UN Oil for Food program, from Kofi Annan, a big aid to the terrorist world, I may say, who could have cared less about 1 million Rwandans being slaughtered. They don't lift a finger for them. So they knew that when they went back to the UN, the French said, under no circumstances are we going to support this war. Why? They didn't say this. Because we have $100 billion in oil contracts waiting for us. Because we built Saddam's nuclear reactor. Because we are in bed and in league with the Arab dictatorships. This is what is, I'll get to your question in a second, but this is astounding to me. I was on the left. The left used to all the time demonstrate, and if you read like Christopher Hitchens' book on Kissinger, what did the left upset about? They're upset because the United States would get in bed with dictatorships because they helped us oppose the communists. Here we went to overthrow a dictatorship, and the left is at war with us because the left doesn't care about the dictatorships. It cares about destroying America, because America is the great Satan. America is the big imperialist power that defends all the others. The left hates America. They will pretend to be patriotic, but what they're patriotic about is the 72 virgins in the sky, that America. When America has a revolution and we get to heaven, that's the America they like. This one they hate, and they will do what they can to destroy. Now, what I said was Iraq. In Iraq, we are in a war. It is a war that is in accord with the bipartisan Democratic Party, Republican foreign policy, the Clinton foreign policy. It's in accord with 17 UN resolutions. It is behind international law. We have got ourselves involved in it. Now, what do? Well, when you're in a war, and it's a shooting war, you can retreat, but if you retreat, the enemy wins. You can't sidestep it. We have to win this war. And everybody who is throwing mud at the President of the United States, who is recklessly calling him a liar, a fraud, every one of these people, Teddy Kennedy, Al Gore, are betraying this country, betraying our soldiers in the field. They have already cost American lives, and they will cause many, many more American deaths if they keep at it. That is the reality. I think we are in a bad situation, whoever wins this election, because of that. So if you're asking me how do you win the ultimate war on terror, that is a very good question. The Bush administration has put out a national security paper called the National Security of the United States. It's October or November 2002. It's on the web, on the White House website, which explains the rationale of the war on terror. And their argument is we have to democratize in some way the entire Muslim world. We cannot allow, we can't let a 1.5 billion people be ruled by Saladins. We can't let them be ruled by people who deny women, education, all of their rights, who rule by Quranic law, who cut the heads off people who lie or say bad words, as just happened in Iran. They hung some kid for using bad language. Because these people also are people who think that they will go to heaven if they kill innocent people. Because these people have access to weapons that can destroy 100,000 people at a clip. What do? Well, Bush has an answer, and Condoleezza Rice, they devised an answer. The Democrats, what is their answer? All they have is slander to throw at the president and weaken us in the war on terror. And I have to say, I accept Joe Lieberman. I exempt Joe Biden. I exempt Jane Harman. I exempt Howard Berman. These are Democrats whom I disagree with on most issues, but who still hold this country dear and are responsible. There are plenty of Democrats who probably hold this country dear who are being completely irresponsible in this, have been for a year now. I hope they come back to their senses. I fear that it will take a terrorist attack on this country to sober people up. Yes, sir.
Given everything that's happened with the UN lately, including the oil for food scandal, and to me, worst of all, with the picture that Israel has of the UN employee loading the rocket into the UN van, do you think the time might be approaching for the U.S. to withdraw from the UN? And if not, what do you think should be done to help reform it?
Well, I was hoping that at the high point after the Afghan war, when Bush was still very popular, and when we were just moving towards Iraq, and when we saw when the French and the Russians defected, and the Germans aren't, not on the Security Council, I was hoping that the Bush administration would construct a new organization, say, of democratic nations. Unfortunately, we went into the war, the Democratic Party left left the war and betrayed the war. You can't fight a war at home with the Democrats, where everything, I mean, I've been up on the Hill here, I'm telling you, every major bill is war. They can't talk about anything. They can't compromise. They can't work together on anything now. And that's the poison that Jimmy Carter and Al Gore have sowed into our body politic by making this war a partisan issue. They were the senior statesmen in their party. They were the ones who first came out with reckless charges against Bush, which were lies and big lies, and not differences of policy, but just actual lies about the president. So I don't see any way, the fact of the matter is we can't just go it alone. It weakens us when we don't have, a world organization or a world coalition. It's a kind of fig leaf. It always has been. We fought the Korean War, but it went in the UN's name. If you think that any country liberated Kosovo but the United States, you're dreaming. But it was done under NATO. We're the only power that can operate because the socialist Europe has given up, taking responsibility. I mean, that's what socialism is about. You don't take responsibility for yourself. So Europe doesn't defend itself. We defend Europe. And because who likes to be dependent? I mean, it's a tough conundrum here. There is no easy solution. So I don't think we can just withdraw from the UN. But the reality is the UN is a moral cesspool. That's what it is. The chairman of the Human Rights Commission is still Libya. With, I think, Iran, Syria, Cuba, they're all part of the Human Rights Commission. Every time I hear a Democrat say, join the World Court, I'm saying, do you understand what the World Court is? Way at the end.
I would like to understand what is the answer of George Bush and Condi Rice. Is it to take over like tyranny? I mean, get off, kick out, tyrants from countries like we did in Iraq? Because if it is the case, America, which is the most powerful army, has only 1.5 million soldiers. It's very hard to attack, to end all the war in
Well, you're absolutely right.
And that Europe is not going to move. So.
You're absolutely right. And therefore, every time a leftist or a Democrat says to George Bush or to a Republican, well, what about North Korea? Well, or my friend Alan Combs, and they list 10 countries that we could go after. We actually can't. You're absolutely right. We don't have the means. We certainly don't have the means when we're divided this way. We are weakened. The Democratic Party has tremendously weakened us in the war on terror. And my complaint about Republicans is, what is the matter with you? Why aren't you saying this every day in every way? I mean, I will say this on C-SPAN, but it needs to be said, you know, on NBC and ABC. It needs to be said by the leaders of our party. The Democratic Party has weakened this country, endangered American lives by dividing us in the middle of a war that they signed on to. If you're asking the long-term question of what they envisage, I thought they picked Iraq to begin with. Next would have been Syria and Iran, and they would have hoped that by taking down Saddam and destroying him, that what did happen in Libya, Gaddafi gave up the biggest chemical weapons factory in the third world. He gave up his nuclear plant. Hopefully, then George Bush would have gone, or sent Colin Powell to go to Syria and tell the government, you're next. You close down Hamas, or you are history. And if they said no, then we would have sent the troops in and knocked them out. And then we would have to confront Iran. And maybe we would get the little maniac in North Korea later. But the fact is that North Korea is really quite different because it's not part of the radical Islamic movement, which is what we are confronting. Make it quick, because there's a lot of people.
It pretty much worked with Syria because Syria is cooperated with Turkey after the terrorist attack in Istanbul. But what are we doing about Pakistan? That was the real base for the Taliban.
Well, again, this is what is so, I hate to repeat these words, but disgraceful about John Kerry's attacks on Bush. The Bush administration is working with Pakistan, they are working with Syria to avoid having to send troops in. But when you have a divided country, the enemy is watching you. They all watch CNN. You gotta go anywhere in the world, you will watch CNN, so you'll get the worst possible presentation, but you'll see, Americans are divided, maybe we can wait them out. Anybody who has read the history of the Vietnam War and its postscript will know that all the Vietnamese communist leaders said, we could never beat the United States on the field of battle, we beat them in the streets of New York and San Francisco and Berkeley. And that John Kerry is proud of that, and that Howard Dean thinks that's great, and it's not just him, but the whole Democratic Progressive Caucus thinks that they did a noble deed in getting 2.5 million Asians slaughtered by the communists is one of the wonders of our time. I've been neglecting this side of the room. Yes, sir.
In recent years, the modern political left has finally revealed its true nature in its coordinated acts of violence. For example, recent attacks on Bush campaign property, violence during so-called anti-globalization riots, and attacks on speakers such as yourself. Is there any hope for civilization, or have we crossed a line that will get only worse?
Well, considering when you got up and I saw that ponytail, I said to myself, uh-oh. And then you said what you said, I think there's hope. Yes, go ahead.
Hi. The title of this lecture, at least as it was advertised in the flyers out in Red Square, was The Lack of Political and Intellectual Diversity on College Campuses.
Yeah.
Should I?
No, you can continue, but just, for a foreigner here, Red Square. I mean, why don't you just call your administration building the Reichstag or something? Go ahead.
Well, you seem to be acquainted with Georgetown, considering you mentioned the professors in the law school, and I was hoping you could expound on the topic title of your lecture.
Yes, I'm really sorry. What happened is that I had said the C-SPAN came in at the last minute. I do have a book, and this is the only chance. I'm not going to get promoted big time by major media. So this is my major media moment. So I shifted the topic of my talk. I have a website at studentsforacademicfreedom.org. We have little booklets that we'll hand out. My campaign, and this is where I take off my partisan hat, is for intellectual diversity. Georgetown, like every other American university, is a one-party state. You have an aging conservative, I know, on this faculty. Perhaps you have two, for all I know. But the reality is that the left, through a subtle and often not so subtle McCarthy blacklist enforced over about 30 years, that includes harassing conservative students in the classroom, completely inappropriate and unprofessional remarks about this election have been uttered, so far as I could tell, in my my spot survey, has violated a fundamental tenet of academic freedom, which is that you don't bring in partisan, political, controversial matter that's irrelevant to your subject. We go to our doctor's offices, we don't expect to find anti-Kerry or anti-Bush cartoons on his office door, and we probably will leave if it's one or the other, and we're not that if we do. Doctors take a professional oath to minister to all their patients. Professors are supposed to be professionals, and they should treat with equal respect their conservative and their liberal students. I would say this whether it was a right-wing professor who was attacking a liberal class or vice versa. That's my campaign. Sarah Dogan here is my national coordinator. We're going to start a chapter at Georgetown University, and I invite you all to join. And it's just about good manners and seeing that you get a good, you cannot get a good education if they're only telling you half the story, even if you're paying $43,000 a year.
I actually want to go back to the topic of your talk real quick. You said that this anti-Americanism has been entrenched in liberal ideology for the past 70 years. I agree, but I'm wondering if that's true, why did the left vote to go to war? What did they...
Well, look, first of all, the left is a spectrum. And I don't call them liberals because they're anything but. If the faculty of Georgetown University were composed of liberals, there would be a lot more conservatives on the faculty. That's just a fact. That's what liberalism ought to mean, a pluralism of ideas. I think the Democratic Party would have stayed with the war if it weren't for Al Gore and Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy and Howard Dean. And if it weren't that people like Kerry were so politically ambitious that they sacrificed whatever their judgment was on the war to, the political wins. And it disturbs me that, right now half the American people will vote for a man who, on a matter of war and peace, will stick his finger in the wind and go which way the political winds blow. So I don't believe that Terry McAuliffe is a closet communist. I think he's a crook. Yes, sir.
Thank you. During your comments, you made mention about the war being about human rights violations and so forth. And so just out of curiosity, following your logic of just war theory, do you think it would have been acceptable for a country to attack the United States, say, during slavery and during rampant lynchings that were taking place and facilitated by our great American government?
Well, I didn't actually say that we went to war for human rights. I said that it's a war that enhanced human rights, and therefore you would think that people who claim to believe in human rights would support it. We went to war because Saddam Hussein was in violation of 17 UN resolutions and showed a clear intention and capability. Once the UN sanctions were lifted, to build weapons of mass destruction and use them against us. No president of the United States, no responsible president, would have let him do that. And the fact of the matter is that both Bill Clinton and George Bush saw that. The difference is that Clinton was preoccupied and couldn't do it, and George Bush did it. And of course, what intervened was 9/11. I don't think, tragically, I don't think without 9/11, George Bush wouldn't have done that. And that may be the way America has to learn what's important. That's the way we went in the Second World War. I mean, Hitler marched all over Europe. In April 1941, Gallup did a poll. Hitler had marched all over Europe. It was 3 months before he attacked the Soviet Union. And they did a poll, and 70% of the American people wanted to stay out of the war. That's human nature. That's just the way it is. Hi there. Well, that seems to be it. I thank you. You've been a civil audience. I appreciate that, and makes me want to come back to Georgetown. Thank you.
David Horowitz is president